Once upon a time, in a kingdom in East Germany, there was a princess who loved to play ball. And there was a goat boy who loved being distracted from his work. The princess and her sister would play all day long, and the goat boy would listen, wondering who it was inside the castle walls. One day he had a chance to find out. He retrieved the ball and then was struck dumb by the beauty of the princess looking down at him from the castle battlements. In return, she threw down to him a rose whose scent was the most beautiful he had ever known. Unfortunately, the king did not approve at all of his daughter having anything to do with such a lowly person as a goat boy. He took his daughter away and locked her up in her bedchamber. She pleaded with him, but to no avail. When alone, she made a drawing of the goat boy, for she had fallen in love. And as this is a fairy story, the drawing and all the characters in this story are only shadows. The princess sat at her spinning wheel, and the king listened to see what she was doing. When the spinning stopped, he was suspicious and burst in on her. The king told his sergeant to find the goat boy and bring him to the castle for punishment. The princess's sister rushed to tell her the news. And when the princess saw the goat boy under guard, she fell into a deep swoon. The best doctors in the land could not find a remedy for the sickness, and the king anxiously paced up and down outside the bedchamber, ready to give anything for a cure for his daughter. She did not awake. No one could help her but the goat boy, who had been sent back to his hut and now thought only of his princess. Convinced that she was possessed by a demon, the doctors tried to frighten it out. At last, an old woman servant of the princess told the king of a cure. At the top of the mountain, there grew a rare flower which could heal all ills, but it was guarded by a fierce dragon, and only the bravest might bring it away. The king called his bravest warrior. "You may rule the kingdom in my place if you can only retrieve the flower and save the princess." The warrior set forth with his squire and embarked on the hard journey towards the top of the mountain. The dragon, like all dragons, lived on a hoard of precious jewels and gold. When the warrior reached there, the dragon retreated away. The man was overwhelmed with the riches that he saw laid out before him. He forgot his mission to save the princess and took up as many treasures as he could. And so he was transformed into a lump of rock. The squire sadly returned to the castle with the message that his master had failed in his quest. A second warrior went out. The dragon retreated back from the horde, and this warrior too was overwhelmed by the riches. For his avarice, he was transformed into a rock. A third knight, and a fourth, and a fifth, all met the same fate by their greed. And now nobody in the land wanted to try the dragon. If the best warriors could not succeed, neither could they, even if it meant they could rule the kingdom. Then at last came the goat boy. The warriors laughed at him, but the king was desperate and gladly accepted his offer. Slowly, the goat boy made his way upwards towards the rare flower until he arrived at the top of the mountain and saw the sword that the first warrior had abandoned. He also saw the dragon's hoard, but though there were enormous jewels, they meant nothing to him compared with the princess's rose. As soon as he cut off the head, two more appeared. And then two more. However many heads he severed, more grew in their place. With a final desperate thrust, he managed to pierce the dragon's heart. The black rocks became men once more, but it was the goat boy who retrieved the flower. He brought it into the bedchamber of the princess, who lay still in a dead faint. The king found the princess and the goat boy embracing like long-lost lovers, which indeed they were. He doubtfully gave his consent to their marriage, and so the princess and the goat boy lived happily ever after.
Vengan todos a escuchar esta sencilla conseja. Es el antiguo romance de la doncella guerrera.
The Warrior Maiden. Spanish people have listened to her story for hundreds of years. How she fought as bravely as a man for the honor of her family and her country. A long time ago, the Spanish king of Aragon called on all the noble knights of the land to join his army against France. Anyone who was too old or infirm had to send his eldest son. In that way, every family would keep its honor. Otherwise, they would deeply displease the king. One old count grieved bitterly, for he had no son to send out. All his children were daughters, so he could not possibly keep the favor of the king. But his youngest daughter spoke up and said, "Father, I will represent you." Her sisters were shocked, and her father adamantly refused to let his daughter go. "Your eyes would betray you anyway," he said. "They're far too beautiful for a man." "Well, I'll look very stern and serious all the time," she replied. "Then no one will notice them." "What about your soft white hands? I can put them in the sun and they'll go brown just like a man's. See?" "Well, I suppose in that case," said her father. "All right. And you'd better go out and look after her." So the lady warrior set out with one servant to represent her father and to uphold the honor of the family. When she arrived at the king's camp, she did her homage to the king and said that she was Don Martin. She was placed in the retinue of the king's eldest son, the crown prince. She soon proved herself to be skillful and enthusiastic in the use of weapons. She was as courageous as any man, and nobody ever came near to discovering her secret. No one, that is, except the prince, who was nearly always by her side and loved her flashing eyes and graceful movements. She gave as good as she got, and her servant was much relieved. But the prince wondered about her. Her voice was so melodious, and she blushed so often. Could Don Martin possibly really be a woman? Surely not. But then again, perhaps. She also lay awake, wondering about the prince. She thought how manly and brave he was. Her servant had his own thoughts, too. The prince's mother told the prince to try taking Don Martin to the market. If she's a woman, she will look at all the material for making dresses and will touch all the fine cloth. Her servant alerted her, and so she went to look at a different stall. Well, Mother, said the prince, she only seemed to be interested in the weapons. You'd better try something else. Take her into the countryside, now that the almonds are in blossom. If she's a woman, she'll stop to smell the flowers. How beautiful they are, she thought. But what she said was, "This will make a fine switch for my horse." The prince returned to his mother, who came up with the obvious test. Take her bathing. All the men in the prince's retinue were enthusiastic for the swim. Don Martin was left to wonder how on earth she could save her secret. Her servant came to her rescue and bribed a scribe to make a forged letter from her father. It was a deception, but the only way to save her family's honor. The Count, your father, is dangerously ill, it says here. Yes, your Majesty, he may die without blessing me. Well, said the king, then you must go. As she mounted her horse, she let out a feminine sigh of grief that she had to leave the prince she loved. The prince overheard her, understood everything, and immediately gave chase. He couldn't catch up with her, and they traveled halfway across the kingdom. Don Martin returned to her mother and laid down her manly clothes and weapons once and for all. By the time the prince arrived, she was at her spinning wheel. He recognized her at once and immediately made his confession of love. So it was that the Warrior Maiden became the prince's bride, and there was great celebration throughout the land. After a few seasons had passed, the Count's sadness at having no son was transformed into the happiness of having a grandson. But as the old storytellers used to say, what does it matter if a child is a boy or a girl? The important thing is that they find their true love. There was once in Hungary a fine castle ruled by a noble king. The king had an only daughter who was more precious to him than his own life. But at that time there were many demons about, and the worst of all the demons was Calamon. Calamon used to lure princesses into his castle and kept them so long that their loved ones never saw them again. Now it was the turn of this king and this princess. Since he couldn't get through the door, he tried the chimney. Come on, king. Give me your daughter. No, said the king. I'd rather die. So Calamon went away, and as he rode, he hatched an evil scheme to force the king to surrender his daughter. He captured all the winds of the kingdom and enclosed them in a bag. Now, without the winds, there was no relief from the heat of the sun. The clouds vanished, and the crops all withered and died. The peasants could harvest nothing. The wheat turned to chaff. People starved, but worse was to come. Calamon released just one wind, the icy wind from the north, which blew the thatch off the cottages and made life even more unbearable. The king did not know what to do. He refused to give up his daughter, and so instead he called for a champion from the people. Whoever would dare to go and release all the winds would have his daughter's hand in marriage. A young farmhand called Janosch took up the challenge and set off bravely to follow Calamon's tracks. He journeyed for many days and for many nights. One day, he saw a baby bear trapped under a tree trunk. The bear was so grateful that he asked Janosch to come and meet its father. The baby bear told the story of Janosch's mission, and the wise old bear decided to help him. He called all the wild boars of the forest and sent one to follow Janosch on his quest. When evening came, Janosch was tired and lay down to sleep. Then, in the morning, the boar was transformed. Janosch could hardly believe his eyes, and then the magic horse transformed him too. The horse could fly through the air as fast as the wind, and they soon reached the land of the demon of the heights. "Where are the winds that Calamon captured?" asked Janosch. "Over there. Good luck." "Thank you," said Janosch, and off they went. On their way, they met a crowd of demons who were organizing a race to decide which of them should be their king. "Could you give me a hand?" the demon asked. "I think I'm going to be left behind." "Get up here," said Janosch. The magic horse quickly outran all the demons, and so they were forced to choose this one as their king. "Thank you," he said to Janosch. "I'll do you a good turn sometime." Janosch found the bag of winds and hacked at it with his sword, but the blade was soon ruined. So he returned to the demon for help. Well, the only way to undo that bag is with Calamon's key, and the only way to get Calamon's key is to defeat Calamon. Here's a sword that should do the trick. It'll slice into him like a knife through butter. "Where does Calamon live, please?" "Over there," said the demon. So the magic horse flew on through the air until Calamon's palace glittered in the distance, for it was made entirely of diamonds. Janosch made his way in warily, admiring the splendor of the palace, till he came upon a vast hall where dozens of princesses were blowing cold air onto a pavilion of ice. There were princesses everywhere. "But where is the key to the bag of winds?" he asked. It's in the Pavilion of Ice. Just then, Calamon appeared. He had captured Janosch's own princess, and it looked as if the deal with the king would be off unless he rescued her. Janosch's sword was as good as the demon had said, and realizing that he was defeated, Calamon pleaded for mercy. Very well, said Janosch, but only if you release the winds. Without the princess's cold breath, the Pavilion of Ice melted away to reveal the key to the Bag of Winds. The life-giving winds brought back the clouds, and Calamon was locked up in their place. Janosch and his princess were married, and prosperity returned to the countryside.
Aucassin was of Beaucaire, of the noble castle there, but his heart was ever set on the fair maid Nicolette, though his father many a day, and his mother said him nay. Thus they raged against their son. But he dreamed of only one, the one he loved. Nicolette, the beauty fair, as a slave came to Beaucaire, and was brought up in the house of a rich man and his spouse. Nicolette dire harm doth face, so her parents in great fear put her in a hiding place where no danger might come near. arm against the foe. Into battle he would go for one kiss from Nicolette. The pledge is sealed. Through the sleeping street she goes, hears close by a voice she knows bewail his fate. Aucassin, with breaking heart, hears her say that they must part forevermore. Praising loud the damsel fair, blue of eye and gold of hair, the shepherds drink to her good health, fair Nicolette. Aucassin has gained Beaucaire, but no parents greet him there. Death has come to end their reign. No joy is his in that fair place, lacking love and one dear face, sweet Nicolette. When she sees the palace walls, sees the houses and the halls, then she knows that she has come to her early childhood home, where her father is the king.
Nicolette this town did flee. Her only love was Aucassin, who found her hid in the forest glen. Parted by the sea and wind, swept to Carthage her journey ends. With no lover will she go, save with him she loveth so.
Aucassin, with pomp most rare, crowned her Countess of Beaucaire. Such delight these lovers met, Aucassin and Nicolette. Thus ends our tale.
Middle Ages, people in Czechoslovakia believed that everything was influenced by the supernatural, and that for every evil force, there was a good one. The stag's horns began to glow with gold, and as the prince prepared to strike home, he was amazed by the sudden change. The stag disappeared, and his antlers were transformed. Now a golden cup stood by the well. The prince was astonished, but not afraid. He looked up and saw an apple tree growing out of the cliff. As each apple fell, out of it there rose a ghostly, beautiful girl. She tried to reach out for the water, but she was carried away before she could touch the cup. When the girl appeared for the third time, the prince instantly lifted up the cup for her, and she drank deeply of the life-giving water of the well. The prince knew that this was the most beautiful lady in the world. He must ask only her to be his bride. Kneeling humbly before her, he pledged his love, and she consented to give him her hand. Then he put on her finger the great jeweled ring, which he had vowed to give only to the one that he would marry. No one but his betrothed should ever wear it. On the crags appeared the harpies, evil birds with human faces. The prince pointed out his castle and her future home. As they set off towards it, he sounded his horn in triumph. Meanwhile, the harpies were joined by their mistress. She broke off the prince's spear tip and followed after him. Now wearing the ring herself, the witch wrapped herself in the prince's cloak and bided her time. The prince noticed nothing of what had happened. In the castle, the news of the prince's betrothal was warmly welcomed by his loyal subjects. first ceremony before the marriage itself was the crowning of the new princess. But everyone was horrified. The face that malevolently stared out was that of an evil old witch. With a brave gesture, the prince plucked off his gown. But the ring that she wore was the ring that only his bride could wear. He could not break his word, and so he could do nothing to prevent the ill-starred match. The marriage must go ahead. And so, showing off her magic, the triumphant witch took up residence in the castle and gathered her evil harpies to her. The prince dismissed his guards and retainers, but there was nothing they could do to avert his fate. He had promised to marry the creature that wore his ring, and so his honor depended on it. He sat alone all night in a vain attempt to discover some means of honorably preventing the marriage. In the morning, the preparations for the wedding began. The bridal veil and gown were taken out and delivered into the hands of the evil old witch. And the rich hangings, carpets, and flags waved in the light breeze of what should have been the happiest of days. Faced with the strange monster, all the servants were terrified. The soldier's gesture of defiance drew down the harpy's wrath, and so in an attempt to defend himself and the others, he tried to ward it off with a staff. The witch was quick to assert her magic power and cast a terrible spell. Now there was nothing the prince or anybody could do against the evil magic of the witch. Where before there had been a happy kingdom, now the harpies directed operations under their mistress's command. The prince was in despair, but he was obliged to continue on his course to marry the witch, for she wore his ring, and he had given his word. Then, at the moment of his despair, out of the mountains where he had found the Lady of the Apple, there came a dove. As it approached, the wedding preparations magically ceased. The dove flew directly to the prince and seemed to kiss his lips. His own spear point was buried in its breast. Perhaps, if he were to pluck it out, an evil would be ended. The witch was all too aware of a threat to her power, and her harpies were quick to do her bidding. All that remained of the dove was a few feathers scattered in the wind. The prince's small ray of hope was extinguished, so he turned sadly to don his marriage robes. Then again, he sensed a power of good in the air, and he tried to discover its source. One of the feathers had grown into a tree. It cast a bright light on the prince, who eagerly sought it out and marveled at the tree. It, too, had his spear point in its heart. Again, the witch acted quickly. Only a twig remained, and the witch crushed it.
It is I that wear your ring. Now marry me, or break your word. Come, everything is prepared.
In the last few minutes before the witch had achieved her plan to rule over the kingdom, an apple blossom was born from the tree. The apple blossom fell onto the nuptial table as the bewitched lady of the apple made her last desperate attempt. At his third chance, the prince at last acted in time. He plucked the spear point from the apple. The witch's spell was broken, and the prince's true bride was able to take her place for the marriage. With the breaking of the spell, all the witch's strength was destroyed.